This is probably the first presentation I made of this nature because the majority of my work surrounds the Zeitgeist movement or things that are related to my film series. But I tailored this very carefully to what I felt the audience of this event would find interesting. The working title, as noted in the program, is When Normality Becomes Distortion, Reflections on a World Gone Mad. But as the talk developed, I experimented with a few other less sensationalized titles to see what would work better. The second one I came up with was When Intuition Fails, the Inevitable Breakdown of Human Assumption and Its Social Consequences. Not bad, a bit too wordy though. So when I finished the presentation, it struck me to have a little more intellectual one. Limited dimensional thought in a multi-dimensional reality. All right, so a little annoyingly intellectual, but still okay. Regardless, I point this out so you can kind of make your own decision which title you think is more applicable, because they actually cognitively highlight different context I'm going to present here. As far as myself, as introduced, it's usually at this point I might say something about who I am, my credentials and experience, as though, frankly, many of us should care. One of the great failures of critical thought is the assumption of authority around a given data set. People might think, well, this person is considered an expert in a given field due to the standards set forth by culture, so therefore I can just trust blindly anything they say without critical evaluation. A rather ominous perspective, and I think most would agree a large number of atrocities historically can be found sourced to this blind dedication to the statements of supposed authority. So who am I? Well, I'm just like you. I'm a compiler and a messenger. You should have no faith in anything I say here and rather be prepared to critically assess whatever issues noted on your own accord within, of course, the bounds of your logical reasoning and training. As I will expand upon later in this talk, there is actually no such thing as the origin of any information. I view knowledge as a life form in and of itself. There is no empirical source, and it evolves and multiplies just like any other organism, utilizing the vehicle of our collective human experience, transference. And like biological evolution, it is self-correcting. Any false thought will eventually, even after long struggles, be seen by the environment and selected out by the collective awareness, or what could also be called the group mind, which I will talk about again a little bit later. Furthermore, the premise of this talk regards not the specifics of any discipline of knowledge or understanding, but the mechanics of it, specifically the nature of its change. I'm less interested in what people think and more interested in how they came to think it and how they maintain it as valid. This talk will not only consider such frames of reference, as they're often called, frames of reference individual people utilize to generate and support their decisions and beliefs, but also the larger order institutions that arise from those referential assumptions, once they are shared by a large enough group of people to hence define social normality, which of course is the status quo that we all know. Then these status quo practices will be qualified or even quantified against what we could haphazardly call our objective reality, which will draw its assumptions from a completely different referential benchmark than most of the population of the world is familiar with, a frame of reference we have come to know as the scientific method. Now, you'll notice I said haphazardly term an objective reality. Why? Because the concept of objective can only be hyperbole, right? How could we possibly be so arrogant to assume at any point in time in human history that we have ever been empirically right? It simply hasn't happened yet if you take the broad view. It wasn't until the past couple hundred years that the scientific method has barely been taken seriously with respect to human affairs and society. And what is the core mechanism of the scientific method really? Self-correction. Self-correction through testing and logical calculation and hypotheses. The self-correction attribute of science is what enables its evolution. There is no recognized phenomenon that isn't undergoing a constant change of definition as the evolution of knowledge continues. Truth itself is an emergent distinction. It's not a noun, it's more of a verb, which constitutes an approach towards reality, but never, ever getting there. That said, it's obvious that we're doing something right, you know. The fact that this building we're in hasn't collapsed upon us means we have been able to come in harmony with some kind of natural physical law that exists beyond our control. The fact that we understand to a certain degree how our bodies work, creating, say, medicines that can help us in positive ways over statistical time, shows that we are indeed in some kind of alignment with what we call nature, as opposed to blaming our sickness on gods and demons as we did in the past as this organism of knowledge continues to evolve. There does seem to be a pre-existing logic, and this is important to note because people take this for granted, a logic, in fact, which dictates our reality and doesn't give a damn what we think of it and impose upon it. It appears we can either be vulnerable and align as best we can and engage this harmony, or we can walk against it, fight it to our personal and social disadvantage. The unfortunate thing is, as I will continue to address later in detail, our basic social construct as a whole, top to bottom, along with the dominant human values inherent to it that support it, appear to be firmly walking against the natural order that exists, that we are slowly discovering, becoming more and more decoupled from reality, as it were, and hence really our life support. For the sake of argument, I would like to quickly reduce human perception to two basic modes of operation, emergent and traditional. Today, the traditional element is clearly the most dominant. It's the cultural zeitgeist, if you will, no pun intended, is always based on institutions that are tending to perpetuate themselves, non-emergent thought processes and their consequences. Why? Because, well, they're forms of psychological security, aren't they? They're also forms of financial security. Our whole society is actually based upon institutional self-perpetuation, whether it is the preservation of a political administration, a corporation's market share and hence dominance, or, say, even a religious demographic. In fact, the traditional notion is so powerful that the very act of questioning is often met with disdain in the culture today. Some, in their defense, would even go so far to suggest that all beliefs and values must be equal and respected, and they must be tolerated in the same element of quality. Is that true? Are all values equal? Does everyone have the right to believe and hence act upon whatever they choose? Are we all to respect everything others want us to? If I put a gun to your head and have the value and belief that you should die, is that acceptable to you? Are you a bigot for not allowing me to express my freedom of belief? Obviously, values are not equal. Some work and some don't. Or more specifically, some represent a closer approximation to reality and others do not. And the farther those values are from this natural order, the more destructive they often become, not just to the individual or group, but to all of us as a collective society. And there rests a distinct social imperative that is often ignored or feared. The taboo associated with challenging what others think under the still convenient notion that all values are equal is simply not tenable. You are, in fact, partially responsible for the thoughts and values of others, and they are, in fact, responsible for yours. There is nowhere to hide from the collective consciousness. And an underlying thesis of this presentation is that until a human society is able to find and share a basic, common, working, responsible, near-empirical value set, we're basically doomed. My hope here, in turn, is to generate a personal and social reflection, if you will, with respect to what you believe and why, eventually to be framed within the social context I keep alluding to. It will be argued that the failure of emergent perception to be open and listen to the world we live in rather than impose upon it, with these traditional assumptions we blindly hold as empirical, is the psychological root of the problems we see in the world today, environmental, social. It is a value system disorder that is continually created and reinforced by the social system we inhabit and share ideologically. And if uncorrected, it could lead to the collapse of human society as we know it today. A collapse, by the way, which, if you're paying attention, is accelerating right now across the world. Fueled again by a set of detrimental perspectives that go largely unrecognized, like cancer cells go unrecognized to an immune system. In 1884, a unique book was published called Flatland. And apart from some very clever social commentary, the work gave a perspective of what it would be like to live in a two-dimensional reality, as opposed to the three-dimensional one that we share. One could go left and right, forward and back, but there was no such thing as up and down. Perspective was hence restricted. And if something from the third dimension was to come and visit this two-dimensional reality, the perception of that object would be confined to the properties enabled by the two-dimensional view. So a three-dimensional object moving up and down through the two-dimensional plane would be perceived by the inhabitants as this mysterious mutating two-dimensional line. I would like to use this abstract notion as a very loose metaphor with respect to cultural perception. What if those in the two-dimensional flatland had actually always been in the three-dimensional space, but their frame of reference was so limited by the tools of measurement they had, their experience so consistent with the two-dimensional world, their associated values so ingrained and stubborn as generations passed that they were simply unable to reconcile its presence, even though it was obviously there. They might have even established whole philosophies and institutions based on the appearance of their world, perhaps the Church of Squares, or linear economics, or the party line of politics. But as time went on and their tools and education grew, the consequences of their perceptual folly started to manifest, and the beliefs and institutions they had created started to draw confusion and disorder as a natural evolution. And they might have thought, how could the very fabric of our assumptions that we all share of this reality that seem correct and almost provable over long periods of time, how could they actually be wrong? Around 200 BC, a Greek mathematician named Eratosthenes estimated the circumference of the planet Earth, likely the first mathematically to solidify that it was truly round and not flat. A rather dramatic finding since, well, it certainly looks flat, doesn't it? In Psalm 93 of the Bible, it states that the world is firmly established, it cannot be moved. And in another passage, it states the sun rises and the sun sets and then hurries to rise again. Well, that would make sense too, wouldn't it? After all, when you look at the sky, it appears to be moving around us. In fact, we still use that premise of thought in our language. We still say up and down when it's really out and in. We even still say sunrise and sunset, interestingly enough. It wasn't until Galileo really introduced our now obvious heliocentric solar system, and it was confirmed, obviously amongst much traditional controversy, I might add. And since we're on the subject of the stars, to continue this type of example as I inch into value systems that perhaps might be shared in the common community, one of the most persistent pastimes of human indulgence since the beginning of recorded history, a practice that has generated a flourishing economic industry to this day, spreading across virtually all cultures, is the practice of astrology. In Western astrology, the signs of the zodiac, depending on their positions in certain time, at a certain time, are thought to have predictive power in some interpretive form, horoscopes, etc. In fact, astrology is so popular today across the world that you can't really read a newspaper without finding a column on it. I even tend myself to be asked what my sign is a few times a month when I engage different conferences. It's very, very common. But what is the basic perceptual source of this belief, especially in Western tradition? Well, it might as well be straight out of the book Flatland. First of all, the view of all constellations are seen as two-dimensional, yet the luminance of those celestial bodies that make up those forms are actually distributed across vast distances in three-dimensional space. Constellations, as we know them, simply do not exist outside of the prima facie pictures we see in the night sky. Second, stars are not fixed, as we came to understand. They are born and they die.